Good morning, everyone. Today we are going to go through a psychological examination of Vernon Dursley. The books are filled with signs that he was abused as a child, and that this abuse rears its ugly head in his adult life in everything he does. And I believe it is the driving force behind his need to be normal. This need for normality shapes every aspect of his life, including his marriage, how he parents, and his career. Before we jump into the books, let's take a quick look at what psychology tells us about how abuse affects people. Abuse can cause a number of problems in individuals as they mature and grow into adulthood. Victims of child abuse have a higher chance of becoming a violent adult. They also have a higher chance of having social problems. They are more likely to report depression, anger, and anxiety. And those who have suffered from childhood abuse have difficulty forming healthy attachments and form disorganized attachments. This can lead to an inability to regulate their emotions. In addition to the emotional problems caused by abuse, it also affects the victim's ability to form healthy relationships. Abused children are shown dysfunctional patterns of relating to people that can impede their ability to form these relationships. A formerly abused individual has a higher chance of selecting a mate who also has impeded social abilities and attachment issues. Children in abusive families are also less likely to observe models of consistent and fair parenting. They would have to look outside their immediate family. In abused individuals, children and mates are often idealized. Children are often viewed as either entirely positive or entirely negative. So how can a person break free from the effects of their abuse? Well, the first one is hardiness. This is the ability to maintain a sense of control in your life, sense of commitment, and a challenge that you can overcome in your life. Next is emotional support from an emotionally healthy partner, going to therapy, gaining a perspective on your relationship with your abusive parents, forgiving the abusive parents, and people intervening in your life. So now let's jump into Vernon. We're actually told very little of his past before the books open. The only members of his family we are introduced to are Marge, Petunia, and Dudley. So I can't help but wonder why his parents are never even mentioned. Vernon and Marge love to dote over Dudley. Why aren't his parents there doing the same? Even if they are dead, it would be pretty easy to have one or two sentences that at least mention them. So we learn about other parents in the series. Lily and Petunia's parents are mentioned. Dumbledore's parents get mentioned. Neville's parents and grandparents show up. And we even learn that Snape's parents were in an unhappy marriage. So why is there absolutely no mention of Vernon's parents? So I believe they are not mentioned because of how abusive they were. If they were alive, Vernon and Marge seem to have cut ties with them. If they are dead, neither of them want to even acknowledge them. So the Harry Potter series likes to show siblings who are stark contrast to each other. Lily and Petunia, Albus and Aberforth, Regulus and Sirius. We also see a contrast between Vernon and Marge, though the differences are not as vast. In the short time she's in Prisoner of Azkaban, we find out that she is much more abusive to Harry than Vernon is. Harry's memories of her include physical abuse, being given dog biscuits as a gift while Dudley got a toy, being chased by her dogs for hours, going well past midnight, and Harry observes that Vernon and Petunia prefer to just not see him, while she preferred to constantly criticize and abuse him. And she even tells him that it's damn good of Vernon and Petunia to keep you. Wouldn't have done it myself. You'd have gone straight to an orphanage if you'd been dumped on my doorstep. Vernon's inability to regulate his emotions are probably the biggest sign that he was abused. And there are quite a few examples I left out for the sake of time, but here are a few of the quotes. When he's at work, we're told that in a perfectly normal day, he yelled at 5 different people, he made several important phone calls, and shouted a bit more. And this was all by lunchtime, where he was in a very good mood. So he seems to have enjoyed shouting at people. When he reads Harry's first letter from Hogwarts, his emotion can be seen on his face because it went from red to green faster than a traffic light. And it didn't stop there. Within seconds, it was the grayish white of old porridge. And it didn't take long for him to be described as an animal as he loses control of his temper. He was bearing down on Harry like a great bulldog, all teeth bared. And he's actually described as an animal quite a few times when he loses his temper, one time being described as a winded rhinoceros. So rather than being someone who rules his emotions, he is clearly a man who is ruled by his emotions. So I find it fascinating to think about how Vernon tries to control his life and achieve the normality he never had as a child. Most of the first chapter of the first book is about this, including the first sentences in the entire series. We get almost an entire chapter from the point of view of Vernon, who has absolutely no blood relation to Harry or any ties at all to the wizarding community. So we read, Mr. and Mr. Dursley of number 4, Privet Drive, were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They are the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. So the decision to focus on him rather than Petunia or wizards at this point in the series is incredibly interesting to me. We learn of his need to be normal, which really stresses how important it is to him. And I can't help but ask why. It's obviously important to everyone to have some sense of normality in their life, but not in the way it is to Vernon. And I can't help but think it's because he had a childhood that was so abnormal that it became his goal in life to become as normal as possible. Because we also see the general disdain that Vernon has for anything even slightly abnormal early in the series and throughout it. On the 3rd page of Sorcerer's Stone, we see what a pre-Harry Vernon thinks of unusual fashion choices. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes, the get-ups you see on young people. Mr. Dursley was enraged that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him. So at this point, Vernon had no idea that he was looking at wizards. He thought that they were just muggles who were just dressing strangely. So we see that this view on fashion applied to anyone that he saw. In Goblet of Fire, Harry knew that the letter from the Weasleys that was covered in stamps would upset Vernon because he knew how touchy they were about anything, even slightly out of the ordinary. Vernon was a man who wanted everything to be normal and standardized. And I can't help but wonder if this is the result of being beaten every time he did something his parents thought was odd. Vernon even manages to have a pretty successful career. The first page of the series tells us he was a director at Grunnings, and that he was able to live in what appears to be a pretty good area. He talks about the new car he has in the first book, and a few books later he gets a company car that he is showing off to the neighborhood. Finally, he also has a business dinner that he hosts in his home with a client that would have been the biggest sale of his career. So all of this shows that Vernon is a man with ambition and the business sense to have a successful career. And this requires, someone to have a certain level of intelligence. So underneath everything else going on with Vernon, he's a man that has this intelligence to have the success that he has. So even though he yells at people while working, he is someone that Grunnings has seen fit to promote up to the level of director. To outsiders, the Dursley family would have appeared to be pretty normal. The things they do with Dudley are normal things that parents do with their kids. He had a bike, they take him to the fair, they spend time with him. There's even a picture of Vernon playing video games with him. And what they do with his birthday also appear to be pretty normal things. And getting Dudley into the school that Vernon attended is also a pretty normal thing. He even says it's the proudest moment of his life. Of course, we know that the way Dudley is spoiled does significant damage to him. And this happened because Vernon and Petunia went too far with the normal things that they were doing. And that the confusion that Vernon and Petunia have when Dumbledore calls them out on this tells me that they're actually pretty unaware of the damage they were doing. So this tells me that their intentions were actually pretty good with what they're doing, and that he is trying to give Dudley the childhood that he never had. However, as we saw at the beginning of this talk, he never learned how to be a good parent since he never experienced good parenting when he was growing up. So for him, a normal childhood would be to get the toys and and go to the fair and things like that. And he went to such an extreme that he did all sorts of damage to Dudley. So we looked at how common it is for parents who are abused to idealize their children. And this would explain why Vernon turned a blind eye to all of Dudley's faults. And we see at the beginning of Sorcerer's Stone tells us the Dursleys had a small son named Dudley, and in their opinion there was no finer boy anywhere. And that this idealization continued as he grew up. They overlooked his poor grades and the reports of his bullying. And it became so extreme that in Order of the Phoenix, that Harry thought they were astonishingly stupid when it came to Dudley. However, Vernon simply couldn't help it. In his psychologically damaged mind, Dudley could do no wrong. It is important to note that with all of his flaws, Vernon is a man who clearly loves his family. I mean, I mentioned this earlier that when Dudley was accepted to Smeltings, that Vernon said it was the proudest moment of his life. Vernon also participated in Dudley's diet to support his son, to help him get healthier. And despite the anger he felt after Dudley was attacked by a Dementor, Vernon quickly accepted Petunia's decision to keep Harry in their home. And when Marge arrived, we're told that he was smiling jovially as he shut the door. So Vernon is someone who is incredibly happy when he is surrounded by those he has accepted as his family. The normality he seeks seems to be for their benefit as well as his. So this love that Vernon has for his family is actually something that actually makes him protective of them. In Sorcerer's Stone, he gets a rifle to protect his family because he believes that they are being chased and hunted by the wizarding community. And he has it out and is ready to use it when Hagrid shows up. He stands in front of Petunia to protect her from a potential attack from Mr. Weasley. And thinking that Mr. Weasley would make things worse, he tries to fight him off after Dudley's tongue is engorged. And after Dudley is attacked by a Dementor, he actually figured out that they were after Harry before Harry figures it out himself. And to protect his family from another attack, he decides to kick Harry out of the house. It's important to know that Vernon actually has a number of legitimate reasons to hate and distrust wizards and magic. To begin with, Harry is just left on his doorstep with a couple letters. Dumbledore didn't even bother to explain anything in person, and this is also how Vernon and Petunia found out about Lily and James' death. And when Harry was set to start at Hogwarts, the Dursleys are bombarded by letters. No one bothered to show up in person until Hagrid essentially showed up and kidnapped him, because he had no actually legal authority to take Harry from the Dursleys. Also, the letters are addressed to Harry rather than to the Dursley. So they're not even telling the legal guardians that Harry is going to start at Hogwarts. And shortly after Hagrid arrives at the hut that they're staying at, Hagrid insults Dudley for being fat, which is never going to endear someone to some parents. And then Hagrid disfigures Dudley by having a pigtail sprout, and then doesn't remove the pigtail, and then involves Harry in a cover-up. And removing the tail required an expensive surgery in London. Harry's rescue by flying car damaged Vernon's house. An owl delivery ruined the business dinner he was hosting, ruining an important sale of drills. Harry inflates Marge, causing her to float. Ministry officials then show up and puncture Marge and then alter her memory, causing her to forget what happened. And then, in Goblet of Fire, Weasleys destroy the electric fireplace that they had and damage their living room, which was quickly followed by Fred and George causing Dudley's tongue to become engorged, causing him to choke on it. Then, a Dementor attacks Dudley and almost consumes his soul. Dumbledore shows up in Half-Blood Prince, causing glasses of mead to just constantly hit them in the head. He didn't even ask them if they wanted mead before he started making this happen. And then in Deathly Hallows, the Dursleys are forced to flee their home for an undetermined amount of time because Voldemort would target them. And this was all because of the war in the wizarding community. So they had to abandon their home. Vernon had to abandon his career, and Dudley had to abandon his education. So if any of us had all of these experiences with the wizarding community, how would we feel about them? I suspect that there's quite a few of us that would not be very big fans of the wizards. So when you consider everything that happened between Vernon and Harry, their final scene is actually much better than I expected when I revisited it. While he's unable to go through with it, Vernon actually makes an effort to give Harry a somewhat proper goodbye. Sadly, he was unable to break free from the chains of his abuse. To Vernon, Harry represents everything abnormal in life, and he could not get himself to go through with a simple handshake. However, Vernon clearly wanted to shake his hand. He sticks it out and pulls it down at the last second and lets it swing, which tells me that there was a battle going on in his mind between the decent man that is buried underneath all the abuse and the abuse itself. And again, sadly, the abuse won. However, there seems to be some level of affection for Harry, in spite of everything that had happened prior to this. Fortunately for the Dursley family, Dudley was able to break free from the generational abuse of the family. The Dementor attack, forcing him to relive his worst memories and examine his life, allowed Dudley to gain a perspective that gave him the strength to break free of the chains that held down his father. And I think it's a testament to his strength of character that he was able to do this. He was not getting any emotional support from a partner, he was not going to therapy, and his parents never made the effort to warn him of the dangerous path he was on. He clearly had a way to go, but he was finally on the right path. And even Harry realizes this, and they actually end up ending on a pretty good note. So what conclusions can we take from all of this? Vernon Dursley shows many signs of being someone who was abused as a child and never fully broke free of the effects of this abuse. And he deserves some level of sympathy since he never chose to be abused or become the monster that he became. However, he was still a monster, and that needs to be acknowledged. But there's still a decent man buried underneath the monster that reared its head throughout his life. He's a man who loves his family and wanted what was best for them. He just didn't know how to fully achieve what was best for his family. And he was able to break free just enough so that Dudley, with the gigantic push that came from the Dementor attack, was able to break free from the generational abuse of the Dursley family, freeing all future generations from this particular abuse.